Thank you very much, Alan. It's really great to be here to take part in this great event today. So thank you. If Alan's going to help me with my slides, so there you are. That's me on the first slide there. And as Alan said, I'm a member of the Committee on Standards in Public Life. So if we just go straight to the next slide, Alan. What I want to do is try to build on Meg's presentation to give you an outline of how regulators help to support high standards. They're an important part of bringing checks and balances on what politicians do. But I want to start by just mentioning some big themes. The first one is that as well as having a system which supports compliance with high standards, it's also really important that we develop a good culture, the way things are done. So we need to get a balance between those two things. It's also worth saying that regulation and the regulatory landscape has changed over time, certainly over the last 26 years, and it always has to reflect social attitudes. And I hope that will come out in the things I say in a moment. But certainly in the last 26 years, there's been quite a lot of changes, many of them actually brought about by recommendations from my committee. And they have been in response to problems, crises, scandals that have come up along the way. And I'll just make reference to those. So it's important to understand that the way in which these things change is very much a reflection of the public's trust and confidence actually in politicians. As a result, then, we have quite a complicated mix of regulatory bodies, I should say. Some of them do have enforceable powers and some only advisory powers, and I'll pull that out as I go through my slides. And the final point is about recognising the delicate balance that has to be struck between the independence of the regulators and the supremacy of Parliament. Again, as Meg has said, the way in which we have done things in our constitution has been about the political accountability that she's mentioned this morning. But of course, recently we've seen, and this has come up through recent years, that people have been questioning whether that political accountability is still working, particularly in the last few months, I'm sure you're aware. So, if that's not working, then that raises questions about whether our regulatory framework is fit for purpose. And in fact, my committee's just done quite a big report on that. But let me take you through it. So next slide, please, Alan. I've mentioned I'm a member of Committee for Standards in Public Life, and these are the 7 principles of public life. Often you'll see referred to as the Nolan Principles because they were established by my committee 26 years ago when it was first set up by the chair, who was then Lord Nolan. Now you can see here on the slide that there's selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. I hope some of those are self-evident to you, but there are 3 that I'd just like to highlight, which I think are particularly relevant. First one is accountability. You've already heard quite a lot about that. But in a democratic system, it is, of course, essential that those representatives of the people are held to account for decisions that they take, for their behaviours, for the way in which policies are put together. The next one below that is openness, which is another word for transparency. And in our recent report, it became quite clear that we need government and Parliament to be much more transparent. It's what is expected in the world that we live in today. And finally, I want to just highlight respect. Leadership is the final principle there, but you'll see I've put in brackets including respect, and we have just made an amendment as a result of our recent work to the leadership principle to specifically include respect for others and the importance of treating all those that politicians work with, both their colleagues and their staff, with mutual respect. And so I just wanted to highlight that one. Next slide, please, Alan. So these principles inform much of the guidance and indeed the rules of the way in which public officials, those in public office, conduct themselves as they go about their business on behalf of the public. So there are 2 key elements of the system then. One is codes of conduct and the other is the independent regulators. So just to say something for a moment about the codes of conduct, these codes are guidance. A code is not, in most cases, enshrined in law. It's not legally enforceable, but it is guidance. usually put together by agreement between the parties concerned. Again, I'll come on to that a bit more in a moment. But they're not enforceable, but they are expected to be followed. The independent regulators themselves have been established, as I've said, often in response to problems that have occurred over the years. And they're there to encourage and promote compliance with high standards and to set the ground rules for a culture of high standards. The importance for the regulators, though, is that they need to have sufficient and appropriate independence and authority from the politicians in order to be effective, in order to be able to hold them to account. But at the same time, we have to recognise that there is a boundary that we must observe, where the politicians have legitimacy and where the influence and the advice of the regulators must end. So it's never a simple question, and I'm sure you'll want to discuss that much more in greater detail. Next slide, please, Alan. So in terms of codes of conduct then, as I've just said, the Nolan Principles inform the codes of conduct, have very wide following. And there are many, but I just want to highlight the three here on this slide. So the first one is the House of Commons Code of Conduct for MPs. This is agreed by the Commons, so it's agreed by the politicians, by the representatives, so that they should see themselves as owning that code of conduct. It sets out the standards of behaviour that are expected. It sets out the guidance on additional income, and of course that's been very much in the news recently. It also sets out the rules about gifts and personal income, which should be declared, and the register of members' interests. I suppose in essence, the code encapsulates both high ethical standards, but also anything to do with conflicts of interest, anything to do with undue pressure on representatives through paid work or other gifts and hospitality. The same applies in the House of Lords, whereas there is a code of conduct for peers, which they have agreed and covers the same sort of territory. Not exactly the same documents, interestingly, because they have been developed in each of the separate houses, but that, of course, has its strengths. And the third one there is the Ministerial Code for Ministers, which I just want to say a little bit more about. That code covers two things, really. It does cover standards of behaviour that are expected, but it also covers much more procedural stuff about how ministers should and could operate. It's been described, therefore, as a hybrid document, and there are questions about whether that is quite the way for it to be constructed. The important thing about the ministerial code is that each prime minister, when a new prime minister comes into office, he or she reviews the code, and it is very much their code. These revisions aren't great, but it is nonetheless at the discretion of each prime minister to set that code precisely as they want it. And of course, it is also the case that the prime minister has the authority, the power, if you like, to decide about any breaches of that code. And it's worth pointing out, and this you'll be aware of this from the issue there was a case relating to Priti Patel as Home Secretary. The Prime Minister has an independent advisor who advises him on the ministerial code. And in relation to that case, in fact, the advisor resigned and we have a new advisor now. But the point at issue was that the independent advisor can independently investigate, but cannot decide on the breach, and certainly cannot decide on the resignation of a minister in the case of a breach. And that's, of course, the right thing, because the Prime Minister is the only person who can hire and fire ministers. But it's a very interesting territory to get the independence right. Thank you. Next slide, please. So let me go on then to the examples of independent regulators. And there are three columns here. So they give you examples of the different types of regulators. So the first one is the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which I've mentioned, which I'm a member. Now, this is an advisory committee, and there are a number of advisory bodies. The committee is made up of lay members, such as myself, appointed independently, although ultimately appointed by the Prime Minister. but appointed through a public appointments process through an independent panel and then approved by the Prime Minister. We are advisory, so we advise the Prime Minister and we make recommendations as a result of our report. Now, many of those recommendations are followed. We've been instrumental in setting up a number of the regulators that exist today, but that isn't necessarily the case. So, for example, recent reports that we have put to the government have not followed our recommendations. So we can only go so far. The second column there are bodies that I would say have been set up under parliamentary authority. So they're not advisory, but nor are they, if you like, legal bodies. The Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, Catherine Stone currently holds that post. So that this arrangement was established by Parliament, agreed by Parliament. And so she has a role which has clear guidelines and a small staff to investigate complaints about the conduct of members of Parliament, members of the Commons. And then she makes recommendations. Now, she makes recommendations then to the Parliamentary Committee for Standards. You can see how this gets a bit complicated. And that's a parliamentary committee, obviously, for the House of Commons, agreed and established by the House of Commons. It's a cross-party committee, currently chaired by a Labour member, Chris Bryant, but also there are lay members on that committee. And they will look at the case. So, I mean, you will have seen this in relation to Owen Paterson. So the Parliamentary Commissioner conducted her investigation. She made her recommendations. They go to the Parliamentary Committee. The Parliamentary Committee considers it, brings forward their report and what they think should happen in terms of the sanctions. They bring that to a debate of Parliament. And that's what we saw just a couple of weeks ago, although it got rather confused in the end. But the process is that has to come to a debate of the House, of the full House. So this is a situation where MPs are judging their own. I mean, it's said, judged by their peers. So there's no independent, apart from the independent people on the committee, there's no greater independence in that system. And that obviously sometimes calls it into question, but that is the system that exists. And finally, I just want to highlight the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority. This was only established quite recently, 2009, and it is a body of Parliament. It's overseen by the Speaker's Committee, which oversees all the work of the House, and that looks at MPs' expenditure and how they are handling their expenses, again in response to concerns that were raised. And finally, I'm probably taking too much time. Finally, there are two bodies on the other side, in the other column, which are legally based. The Electoral Commission looks at how elections are run and looks at donations to political parties, but that is created by a law in 2000, so it has a legal basis. And also there is a register of consultant lobbyists, another example. I thought it was worth mentioning lobbying. So that register was also established fairly recently. And all independent lobbyists, whether individuals or organisations, must register with this independent body, and the commissioner of the register owns that and will make sure that people are following the rules, are registering and are complying with the rules. So those bodies have a legal basis, are on much stronger footing, if you like, than the other types of bodies. So next slide, please, Alan, which is my final slide. I just want to highlight some of the key issues. For a regulator to be effective, these key issues need to be thought through very carefully. First one is that there is access to bring a case. So it's clear that if a member of staff, if another MP needed to bring a case, then they understand how they can do it and where they can go. Second point is about the impartial authority of regulators to investigate and a fair process. It's really important that the authority of for example, the commissioner, parliamentary commissioner, to be able to investigate impartially and for that not to be interfered with by politicians, and for a fair process to be followed, not only for those who are bringing a complaint, but for those who are being complained about. It's really important that the regulators have independent authority to reach conclusions again, so they are not fettered, they are not limited by parliamentary influence. They are free to draw their own conclusions. And then we have to think carefully about the authority to apply proportionate and appropriate sanctioning powers. The ministerial code is a good example here. In the past, it has been the case that, generally speaking, a minister would have resigned if they breached the code. Now the committee is saying, and it's generally regarded to be the case, that there might be a range of sanctions which are more proportionate to the breach that has occurred. But as I said right at the outset, for example, with ministers, only the Prime Minister can make that decision in the end. And last but not least, when there are significant sanctions being applied, it is important to think about a process of appeal. That occurs in some cases, but not in others. I'm sure I've covered my time scale now. Thank you very much.